Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple systems I want to check in on. It's really just one system I want to check in on, but it's really a system that's going to end today. So the other system is really going to be the system that gets launched off, which is this presently unoccupied bin that I built 18 days ago. So the worms over in this tray here, they've been migrating. It's what I refer to as migrating. I set up a baiting area within the bin, try to lure the worms over there. It's been 14 days that action's been going on. It was even a week ago that we went into there to replenish the food supply just to make sure that process is working well. And even then, a week ago, it already seemed like that system was more or less evacuated, that we could have just hauled the worms out then and treated the remainder of the material in the bin as finished castings with which we could optionally start off a cocoon nursery. But we decided to wait a little bit, but today I believe we're going to get to work on bringing a close to that system over there. I got some information about it here on this little board. 182 days is its age, which consists of 128 days of composting, during which time 15 feedings were applied, and then I had this 40-day period of rest of no feedings or anything like that, just a period of time in which the worms can forage through the material and break all the remaining bits of stuff down nicely. And then now, like I said, 14 days, the system has been getting migrated, and I've applied 2 feedings so far to spur on that action. And I believe that today is the time to get the worms out of that system and call that system done. Now, I've been treating my 2 European nightcrawlers as sort of sister bins in a way, because there's only a week difference in their ages. And the younger one is not quite at that migration stage yet. It's been foraging for 5 weeks now, and at some point soon I might initiate the migration, but we're not here to deal with the younger of the 2 bins. We're here to bring an end to the older of the 2, so why don't we get started. So now when the work here is complete, the system here that's got the castings in it, and at some point it will no longer have the worms in it, I'll affix this container with a new label showing that this is a cocoon nursery. I usually kind of use a half-size label for the cocoon nurseries. And then the new bin, the one that I built 18 days ago, which is where the worms are being relocated to, will be christened with this label, showing that today it's launching off as a new worm bin with European nightcrawlers in it. And to help me get that job done, I've got my trusty little tray here that I usually do my haul outs in. So basically it's a matter of just rounding up the entire contents of the feeding area that I had set up to migrate the worms out of the finished compost. And then there's really not a whole lot left to do other than cover it up and let things continue so that the cocoons scattered throughout this material here have a chance to continue to develop and hatch and produce baby worms for us. It's like I thought I just saw a pretty dark cocoon over there. I thought I saw a somewhat lighter color one right there, although that's pretty dark too. Sometimes I just start to spot cocoons. I think here's another pretty dark colored one, a couple of them right next to each other, pretty dark ones. Sometimes I really struggle to spot the cocoons. Other times they seem to just appear. So yeah, I think this material is actually going to be pretty good for the worms as far as there being residual bedding and food scraps in this stuff, as well as residual moisture. There's always sort of this little tug of war going on in my worm bin when it comes to the castings. At times like this, when I'm trying to get the worms to move out of this stuff, I steer the stuff towards drying. That's why it was covered only with that newspaper, to allow the stuff to dry a little bit. And then when it's time to try to, get these cocoons in this material to start hatching, that's when I'll usually try to start reintroducing moisture back into this stuff to try to trigger that action. So at this point, the drying of the castings no longer needs to continue, since its goal has been achieved, or at least I'm assuming so. Last time we checked in here, it certainly seemed like the goal was more or less achieved already. But we decided to continue anyway. We reinforced the feeding of the horizontal migration feeding zone with additional food and bedding. So it does seem like at this point we should expect to see that there's pretty much no worms remaining in the finished castings. It's really just a matter of hauling these little guys out of here and getting them into their new home. Every now and then I do feel like I build the feeding area so large that I don't know if I'm going to be able to fit the entire contents into this box, but I think it should work. So why don't we get started? I'm just going to bring this one piece of paper back here to rest our container on top of, and then I think we could really start just sort of scooping things out. That's really all it consists of. I mean, sometimes if it's easy enough to separate large chunks of stuff, then I'll do that just to sort of unclutter our view of the worms that collected over here. But this stuff really does consist of a whole lot of really fine shredded cardboard and paper, all kinds of bedding materials, and it would be pretty tough to really separate all the worms from all this material that they're inhabiting right now in order to get a really good look at them or to be able to measure them or weigh them or something. So a lot of times I'll try to come up with a rough estimate of how many worms we're dealing with here, but in most cases it really is just a rough estimate. Here's some more large chunk things here. Looks like a fairly fresh coffee filter was probably just placed in here fresh last time. I think the way I draped it out across the top, its job was probably also in part to hold moisture down within the system. I think right up here against the wall is where I had placed a good amount of really fresh, brand new bedding. This stuff doesn't really seem to have a lot of worms in it. Maybe we can just sort of transport that stuff over to the new bin independent of the worms. So if we're a little bit careful, we can possibly minimize the amount of clutter that surrounds our worms so we can get a somewhat better look at them as we transition them from their old home into their new home. You can see some of the food that had been placed in here. These chunks of pumpkin were put in here to make this feeding area irresistible. Not only is it yummy food for them, but it's also loaded with moisture. So besides luring the worms over to here with the yummy foods that have been placed in here, it's also a matter of providing them with a nice damp space to hang out, which is probably a big relief for them once they arrive in this stuff compared to the relatively dry castings that they've been living in up until that time. So I think the time has come to start pulling this stuff away from the little dividing wall that I've put in here to separate the finished castings from my feeding area. So I'm going to see what I could do about just pulling things away so I can get a better view. So I'm also interested in kind of skimming that border, that edge between the two layers, or at least I don't even know if you could call layers since they're horizontal next to each other. Not really layers per se. Regions, right? You got sort of the finished compost region, and then you've got the baiting area, feeding area. So I'm going to see if I can just remove these as well. I just don't want to have worms crawling back down into this finished compost over here. Hopefully they'll just kind of land down in this little pile of bedding that we've extracted. Because then, as nice as these castings are down here, I'm not so worried about coming up with a nice batch of finished castings. I'm really more interested in coming up with a high degree of extraction, getting the majority of the worms out of here versus allowing them to remain behind in the material that they were occupying. So this could very well be the best view of the worms we get right now as we gradually extract them. So I'm going to see what I could do about formulating sort of a guesstimate about how many worms are being used to occupy this new bin that we're launching today. I don't even remember what the estimate was in terms of how many worms we thought we had in this box. A couple thousand sort of rings a bell for some reason. And it's certainly plausible if you look at how many worms come out in each handful. Big ones, little ones, they're everywhere. Even when you come across a piece of bedding or paper or whatever, something like this, it's even loaded with worms in between the layers and everything. They're kind of hiding out in places where you can't even see them. To me, though, this piece of paper here just seemed like an extractable hunk of clutter, so I thought I'd get it out of there. But I think I should make quick work of this extraction here before our worms start to bug out because of the disruption and start to crawl into the finished compost. I'd really like for them to stay in the nice damp feeding area, the material that was laid out for them. And this stuff is chock full of castings. In 2 weeks they've really transformed a very good amount of it from bedding into castings. I mean, we really more or less got the entire population of the entire bin crammed in this quarter of the container. So we're definitely nearing the tippy top of this box here. Running out of room to extract any more. Maybe just a little bit more if we need to, and I think we just need to pull a little bit more out of here, and then we've got more or less all the worms. And I don't need to go bananas on this here because as I alluded to earlier, this batch of finished compost will continue to serve kind of a new function at this point, not as a composting container any longer, but as a place in which the enclosed cocoons are being kind of nurtured so that they'll eventually hatch, produce baby worms. And then once that's occurred, I think it's times like that when you can sort of feel like you've got some castings that are ready to go and be used. And a lot of times, you know, people don't even concern themselves with the cocoons. Sometimes you'll get, you know, a few hundred worms out of the deal. It takes time and patience to allow for the cocoons to hatch. Some people just don't really want to deal with it. It takes extra space to contain the castings and enable the cocoons to have a place to mature and hatch. So totally an optional step that I've only recently started doing as sort of a routine process in my systems. So all this other stuff here has a few worms in it, but I believe I'm just going to sort of, in advance of us releasing these little guys, I'm going to just throw all this stuff into the new system. But before we could do that, I think it's time to start packing up this system, which is now technically a cocoon nursery anymore since all the worms have been extracted. I really would like for all the worms to sort of remain in this mound here. I don't want to release any or too many back down into the finished castings. So I'm going to shove this aside just for a moment, bring over the new system so I've got a place to put all this stuff. I haven't even really checked in on this new system in a while. I built it over 2 weeks ago. I don't even remember if I added food. I most likely placed only bedding materials in here. Although sometimes I build my new systems with food. I just don't remember what option I selected in this case. Perhaps if we're in here already, we can ascertain what I did. Usually if I put food in, I kind of scatter it throughout the system, but I don't see any remnants of any food. What is a little bit unusual though is that I'm finding a little bit of standing water at the very bottom of the system. A little bit unusual considering the material up here is relatively dry. Usually with a plastic covering on it, the way this system has had for the past couple weeks, any moisture in the system would usually attempt to evaporate and in the process get sort of caught in upper layers of drier material. So here I just feel like I want to jam some of this drier stuff down into the standing water that I see down low, because I almost feel bad releasing worms into material that's as dry as this is here on the top surface. We'll just do a little bit of this transposition of dry materials off the surface down low. Perhaps even bringing up a little bit of the more damp stuff that's down low. I mean, I don't think it's dangerously dry. I don't think it's going to cause the worms to freak out. But I think just by bringing up some of this more damp stuff, I assume there's sufficient moisture in here with that standing water at the bottom to hydrate all of these somewhat drier materials in here. But luckily, when we're bringing these little guys over, they're coming over with the material that they were occupying within the feeding zone of the old system. And that also consists of all this stuff that we're transferring over with them. So I think as long as we're positioning these little guys right on top of this old familiar material that they used to occupy in the feeding zone of the old system, I think they'll be content for a while. And then eventually they'll be able to kind of roam around and get acclimated in their new space. So here's a pretty good sized piece of paper. I wouldn't want it to become sort of an obstacle preventing them from diving down into the material. We'll release them here, drop them in. Even these cardboard pieces, I don't want to have anything that's going to hinder them from diving down, taking shelter from the overhead lights. So I'm going to sort of try to open up the field here a little bit so that when we do release them into their new space, they can easily get down into the material. But here, let's wrap up over here before we continue. It's really just a matter of returning the coverings that were on here. If there's little worms left behind, I'm not going to worry too much about it. That is going to be the goal here eventually anyway, is to come back in here after some time has passed, and the expectation will be that we're going to be able to haul out some baby worms from this stuff. So it's really just a matter of getting this thing covered back up so that it doesn't continue to lose any of its moisture. And we're kind of reversing, let's get this little guy in his new home too. We're kind of reversing course on how we've been managing these castings. Now putting the focus on getting them nice and damp, or letting them stay nice and damp, so that whatever babies emerge into this material, they'll be comfortable and have sufficient moisture. So, got another worm here on this piece of paper here. We'll get them into the new location. So it does seem like a couple layers of paper can't hurt in order to keep the moisture down within the system. And you saw this thing was kind of folded up to limit the amount of coverage it provided over only the feeding area. At this point, we are going to return it to full size so that it gives us maximum coverage once again of the material in here. And now I believe there's not much left to do here other than grab the new sticker, stick it on here. I've just been putting it on top of the old sticker so I know what its origin was. And now we're going to have ourselves a little cocoon nursery here for the European nightcrawlers. Let's get this thing out of the way and we'll continue work here. So I think we can simply bring the new container back into view and drop in the worms, I guess. Not much left to do, right? Get these little guys situated in their new home, let them get cozy. Man, there's a lot of weight to this. It's probably not only the moisture of the contents of the bin, but it's probably the worms themselves. So let's not wait any longer. Let's get them into their new space so that we can call it a day. All right, here we go. See one in here. We're gonna have to get him out. Got a couple of them in here. Okay, fortunately, most of them like to sort of stay with the material that they're inhabiting. I think we've got them all. Look at that big block of stuff. I know it's in large part bedding and leftover food, pumpkin bits, you name it. It's made up of all kinds of stuff, but it also consists of a good number of worms. So I'm just going to let these little guys get situated in their new home here. These bright lights will probably cause them to want to dive down. These Euros do tend to shy away from the bright lights. Let me just get them away from these cardboards so that they can in fact dive. Alright, let's leave these little guys to be for a little bit. Well, I still see a worm or two, but I think it is more or less official. We've got our worms moved in. So, please join me in welcoming the newest of my worm bins. And customary first step to do is to label it with today's date and the breed of worm that's in the system. Unless, of course, it's red wigglers, in which case I usually don't label it. Another one of my weird little standards. So, there's not a whole lot left to do here. All I've really got to do now is start returning some of these coverings to the system, more or less the way we found them when we first got here. Once again, this plastic is intended to keep the moisture down within the system. Hopefully the environment we've created for these little guys is comfortable for them. Oops, looks like this little spider didn't make it. Usually I don't mind spiders in my wormery, but that little guy looks like he crawled down into here and oh, look at that. I thought he was toast, but I thought I saw him move. I think I'll just leave him here on my tabletop. But for now, I think we're done. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.